All right. What do you want to go? Well, you mentioned something. So work's being a pain. So
Yeah, since we did just talked about branding and customer, let's look at um defining requirements or understanding requirements, because the biggest problem I've been struggling with this week especially is I've been given two tickets to do that literally are image size is incorrect on report, nothing else in the ticket. Other ticket is getting an Excel styling exception with load testing. That's it. That's all that's on the ticket, just the title, nothing in the requirements. What am I supposed to work with? How do I define the problem? And that's been a huge struggle. It's like, you can tell someone to go dig a hole, but if it's not in the right spot, you'll tell them to dig it over here. Well, eventually your yard ends up looking like Swiss cheese, right? And the hole is nowhere near where you want it. It's like that movie Holes. It's like you
yeah,
just keep digging holes. Um, but I think that would be a good topic. How would we define that, or what do you think it should be?
I think that's not bad. I think it is definitely something that we run into all the time, and it's figuring out how to handle that. The good news is that you've got that is actually a step, I think, ahead of a lot of people. There's just a lot of developers out there. They get that ticket and they just like, okay, I'm going to go work on it. And then, a week later, I see this in sprints all the time. It's like, oh yeah, I'm going to take these on. And then they get to it and they read it and they're like, well, this doesn't have anything useful. Or they'll build it and it has, because they'll see a title like, yeah, this is what I'm going to do. And you're like, wait a minute, that's not at all what what needed to be done. And now you've wasted your time and you got to go back, and sometimes it's you have to uncode stuff or basically recode entire sections, pull stuff out, lots of issues. So I think that's the whole, how do we deal with requirements and how do we go back and ask for more requirements. I think it's a pretty good topic for us, so if nothing else, we'll give it a shot. I'm going to take 30 seconds. I'm going to refill my water, though. Those of you that are there, play solitaire for 30 seconds.
And for those of you watching the bonus content, these kinds of questions that I'm bringing up, or these problems, not only is it a problem where you might get the wrong solution architected, but you may, if you're paying contractors or you're paying people hourly, you have to figure out the time and the costs that if you just give someone a ticket to do or just some baseline requirements, it could cost you a lot of money to go have them build something if you don't have anything defined properly.
And so let's dive in. Well, hello and welcome back. We are continuing a season talking about problems. We're just like moaning basically about work, but not really, because we're also talking about how to advance your side hustle, advance your career, advance some of the problems that you're running into. This time in particular, we're going to talk about requirements. We're going to get back into this discussion. We've touched on it a few times, I think even already in this season, but want to dig back in because it is painful. It is something that can be a pain in the butt to deal with, and you need to be sure that you need to be comfortable getting the right requirements, and you need to be detail oriented enough to make sure that you're looking at whether it's a ticket, whether it's a design document, requirements document, depending on how things are delivered to you, that you are looking at that and digging into the details and thinking through it. And where there are potential assumptions, you ask questions about it. And first, before we get too far into it, I'm Rob. I'm going to just welcome you back, Mike. We've been here the whole time, but throw this over to you. You can introduce yourself a little bit, and we will dive into our requirements discussion.
Sure. I'm Michael Malash. I'm founder of Envision QA and co-founder of Developer. And like Rob, we're both developers. We've been in the industry for many years, and requirements is a key issue that we constantly run into when working on software or even testing. And one of the biggest problems we have is lack of requirements or insufficiently defined tasks that are given to us that essentially could cost the company time, money, and have an insufficient product be developed.
And I think that's where we want to start is and the funny thing I was thinking about this is we did a season way back. Way back. It's been a couple of years. I forget what season it was, but it was a season of mistakes. It was basically walking through, it was learning from mistakes. And one of the things that we got at the end when we're sort of summarizing whatever it was, the 30 episodes of different problems and mistakes that have been made, one of the things that came around was communication, was just being clear on what you're building and the customer having that drawing out of them clarity on what they need. Because it is, as we mentioned, way too often, there's people that are like, hey, I want to build Airbnb for, pet houses or something like that. Whatever it is, it's just, it's, I want Uber for tricycles, whatever it is they've got something that exists and it's a good idea in a sense because, like, hey, let's take this thing that's already there, let's flip it on its head a little bit, and we're going to rebrand it in this other direction because that's not being served. Awesome. But it's then they come to you and say, well, just look at Airbnb and then bake something like that. It's like, no, it's like Google. Just make something like Google. It's like, okay, I can write a page where you're going to, put something in there and it'll give you some results. That is not Google. Behind the scenes, there is insane amounts of stuff behind there. So we need to, one, recognize that, and two, talk to a customer about that. And instead of which so often you get the requirements are like, well, just do it like this, or it just looks like that, is actually get into okay, this is what you're showing me. Let's walk through this. Here's where we start. How does somebody get here? Once they're there, what do you envision them doing? Okay, when they do that, should there be a notification? Should there be a warning? What if they do it wrong? And just follow through that. And then what kind of approach is so that whenever they're like, okay, we're going to do this. Okay, and then what happens? And then what happens? And then what happens? What if this happens? It's that conversation. It's building out it's world building in a sense, but it's just for their problem and their solution and talking through what those requirements are and, really starting to draw that information out because as Michael said, if you don't, you can go on a very different journey than they need you to go on, and it can be very expensive. It can waste their money, it can waste your time, it can cause bad blood between you. There's so many challenges that can come from not having the requirements. Now I'm going to throw this to you, Michael, but then I'm going to come back and I do want to talk about what happens when it's intentional that you don't almost, and where you can go with that. But first, let's stick to that requirements discussion, that conversation.
So the way you laid it out is the typical way we as developers or engineers go about or should be going about defining the requirements of the ticket, or at least reviewing what it is that the customer wants to make sure that what is being built meets their requirements. However, from a testing perspective, we should take that step one step further and then actually ask, why are we doing this? Why is this needed? And if you ask those questions, you could even determine that, oh, what we're trying to build isn't even what the customer wants. Because I've run into situations where, like, the business owner or the project owner or even the customer thinks they want one thing, but it's something completely different. So the requirements for what you're building, yes, may be flushed out, may be right, or may need some additional tweaks, but they may not even be the right requirements for the solution. You might need something totally different. So there's a couple things to kind of unpack there. So one, uh, understanding what the end result is, not the end result from the task, but what is it that the customer or the requester wanted before the ticket was created? What is it that they are expecting to come out of this change? Walk back from that, then go to the requirements and say, okay, this is what the end user wants. This kind of goes back to that tree swing model that's all over the web. Customer wants a tree swing. So you go back and say, okay, so what is it that you want to do? Well, okay, I want to be able to sit on a tire on a swing and just swing underneath a tree. Now, the requirements that could have come to the developer could have been, okay, we need to put swing in a tree. Well, what kind of swing? Is it atypical two ropes and a board? Is it a tire and or a string and a tire, or just a rope? Right there are three possible implementations based on a very vague requirement. So you have to really flush that out a little bit more. Now, in the real world, typically we're under deadlines and or sales or marketing has already committed us to X, Y, and Z. Here's the requirements run. Oh, by the way, it's due next week. You've got to rush to get those changes out the door. That can lead to unintentional consequences where what you're given isn't what the customer wants. So that's one thing I would really stress is not only look through each step as to what is in the ticket, but make sure you understand what the ask is of the ticket or the requirements that are coming to you.
Yeah, and I think that's why you have that discussion around requirements, even is and minimize assumptions. Is talk to people about what is it that you want done? What is the and it really goes back to what is the problem that do you think this is going to solve? What is the issue that we need to deal with? Even with bugs. I mean, we get this all the time, and we're usually better with bugs because somebody will say, "Well, it doesn't work." Okay, that doesn't help me. What doesn't work? How did you get there? What does working look like? And when it works, what do you expect? What is the expected outcome? It really goes to the why do you think this doesn't work, or why do you state it doesn't? And what does a solution, what does fixed look like when it's fixed or repaired or corrected or working or whatever it is? What does that look like to you to make sure that we can get from where we are to where we want to be? And even if you're, and I think even more so, if you're under deadlines and under pressure, it is so much more important to start with, let's dig into this. Like a lot of times it's like sit down, talk through the tickets, the requests, the requirements, or whatever it is, and really get into that conversation. And I know that you guys are probably rolling your eyes because there are those places where you just get stuff. The CEO comes in and it's like, hey, here's what I need you to do. And I have to have it next week because I got a sales call. Cool. Awesome. You're going to have to give us more. And he's going to be busy or she's going to be busy and they're going to run off and be like, no, you guys just go make it happen. It's like, well, no, either you need to talk to us about this or we need to have access to the customer you're selling it to or something like that. Because then we may not have enough time to build this. We may not have what we need, but there are opportunities like there's triage, there's MVP. I go back the first time I got my name in a book as a author of like software and stuff like that. The original product we built, and it was two of us basically. We got the idea on like 2 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. They were going to salespeople were going to a conference. They were leaving that night. They were going to have stuff all day, booths Saturday and Sunday. And we worked through the night, threw something at them based on this new concept. And then they gave us feedback through the day. We gave them updates. We did it again Sunday. And we had a really like big on the MVP maybe by that Monday, but it was basically it was really more like duct tape and baling wire. But it's also comes to the idea of building a clickable demo of some sort, something that you can put in front of that CEO, that customer, that whoever it is, and say, this is what this is going to look like. Before you've invested too much time into it, give them what you can so they have a sense so that you can set the expectations of this is what we're building. This is what you're going to end up with. So they can either say, yeah, that looks great, or no, I've got this whole other thing that I want to be done. And then say, okay, well, work with them within that. So it's not, and sometimes it is. I think we push back too much because we don't want to do, we are too strongly against the approach that they're taking. And so we sell it as that. It comes across as that. It sort of is us just poking holes in their requirements, but really we need to be pushing towards, instead of pushing back, is dragging them forward and saying, okay, I'm hearing these things. So how about we do this? How about we do that? Hey, we can do this. We can do that. Sometimes it's like, hey, we cannot provide you this, but we can go provide you this other thing that gives you essentially the same solution. The one I think I've mentioned before that is like the quintessential project gone bad because somebody thought they were too much into the implementation was we spent I think a month building a solution to pull down. This is dealing with like hundreds of thousands, millions of rows on a web page, and being able to like you have to be able to page through them, and you have to be able to page through them quickly. The page has to come up quickly, and like all the time, 100,000, a million rows. There's just to display those on a web page is just a lot of stuff. And even if you're paging it, whatever you're doing, somewhere along the way, you're having to pull all that data into the page. And whether it's going back and forth, however you do it. And it was not fast enough. There was nothing close to it. And we went around and around and around and finally got down to like really, and part of it was because it was under pressure. So initially it's like, okay, we're just going to get it done. We're going to make it work. We're going to make it work. And finally it's sort of like, wait a minute, back this up. Why do we need to present 100,000 rows to a customer? And it finally got to, well, what we need to do is we need to get to the last page and have at the bottom of that page a count of the number of rows. So what they really needed, they didn't care about any of the detail. They cared about that one number. It's like, why don't we just give you a summary report that's one page, has that number and like three others? I'm like, oh, you can do that? Yes, we can do that. And it's so much easier, so much faster. And it's somebody was so focused on this is what we need and this is how it needs to look. And it was just this is where you are a better developer instead of just a coder. This is where you become a developer and you're not just writing code, is instead of just go do it, as you used earlier, that dig a hole. Okay, dig a hole over here. Oh, wait, that's I want the hole there. And the next thing you just dug a lot of holes. Instead, before you get into digging holes and tear up somebody's yard, you go, okay, why are we digging this hole? Because we want to get to a well. Okay, well, let's first make sure that when we dig a hole, we're going to actually hit something that's got water, or whatever it happens to be. Those are the things that we need to push back, particularly as we get into, when we're starting out, we're paid to just write code, basically. We're not paid. Some people think we are, but basically we're paid pennies and it's basically to go write code. But as you get further into your career, you are paid to be, even if you're an employee, like essentially a consultant, somebody that is bringing something to the table other than writing code, that you're actually able to push stuff back and say, hey, yeah, that's an important problem to solve. Let's think about solving it in this different way because it would provide, we can get you a solution faster or better or whatever that happens to be. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I run into that a lot. And I agree. This is one of those things where if you're just starting out as a coder, you're typically just going to jump in and you're going to try to do the solution. You're going to try to do something to make it work. More mid-level, you're going to be asking a lot more questions, but typically you'll still probably start and then have questions as you go along. Um, and more at the higher end, the engineer, the architect levels, you're going to be asking lots of questions before you begin. With this in mind, though, with a lot of the software approaches, especially with Agile, where you go through the process of kind of pointing tickets ahead of time, you review tickets in refinement, but you don't technically get to those tickets for a month or two, or even 6 months down the line. And your requirements can get stale. Now, they may be fleshed out at the beginning, but what is your take? How would you handle the approach of taking this ticket that we already have and we have fleshed out the requirements, but maybe there's been some additional changes in other tickets that now make that one obsolete, or whoops, now it's not going to work the way we anticipated it.
That's the whole point of, really, to me, that's like really the whole point of Agile and having backlogs and things like that, is because you regroom. You don't just like pull tickets. When you're grooming, you're actually reviewing tickets in the Agile approach. And let's just stick with that as an example, is that you're looking back through these, and these could have been put a year ago. And I have been in those situations on more than a few times where you've got something that's been sitting there for a long time, like months, maybe a year or more. And now we're finally getting this ticket, and we're like, okay, this doesn't make, sometimes, a lot of times actually, it doesn't make sense anymore because things have changed so much that it's either, sometimes it doesn't even make sense at all. So you just throw it out. And sometimes if you've got a good scrum master or product owner, then in their interactions, those things will just disappear when those things are no longer needed. but sometimes they're needed, but it's very different from the original description, definition, and requirements. And in those cases, is it goes back to just like you would with any other one. You're going to look at that and say, okay, you're telling me that we need to do A, B, C, and D. Cool. Okay, A, I get, but B, C, and D don't make any sense in what we have. So how do you see that working in our current environment? It's those kinds of questions. It goes back to ask those questions. And again, you don't have to go back, and you don't want to. I don't think you don't want to go back to the backlog tickets every time and keep updating those. But when you get to a point where you're going to pull one forward, that should be part of the discussion. Is this still valid? If it is, are there changes to it? Are there additions? And keeping those fresh, basically, particularly if you are moving along in an agile approach where things are changing as you go. Now, if you've built something, you're more like a waterfall and it's been very static and everything was laid out beforehand, then you may not have to worry as much. But somewhere along the way, you do still need to do that. And I would always do it as you like as a just in time kind of approach. Like I'm going to go work on this ticket. Before I'm going to work on it, I'm going to review it. I'm going to ask my questions about it because even if the requirements haven't changed, your understanding may have changed. And so the questions you have may be very different than you would have had a month ago, 6 months ago, or a year ago.
Right. And it's kind of interesting because this kind of gets into an approach I've wondered for a while. Should you be putting tickets out there or defining requirements for a coder or a developer to work on 6 months out, a year out? Should you keep that as an epic at a high level? And then when you get time to actually sit down and work on it, yes, you flushed out the high level requirements, but then you actually get into the technical requirements at that point, and then you flush them out. There's been a lot of situations I've been in where 6 months ago, we planned everything out for the year. We planned, okay, this project's coming here, this project's coming here. Here's all the requirements. It's all flushed out. And then 6 months later, we have to do it all over again because the whole project has changed. Or we abandon all that work because nothing is going to, we've gone a totally different direction. Or the other problem I've run into in some situations is where the group of people I'm working with or the project I'm working on has now changed hands three, four, five, six times. And the people that actually wrote the requirements or defined it aren't there anymore. So you have no one to go ask the questions of other than just try and find someone to go back and talk to the customer. And it can be very frustrating and very hard. So we have to make sure we ask those questions and flush them out. But it's just, I'm curious on your point. Should we be defining tickets so far out, or should we only really be refining tickets that we're going to pull into the current sprint or within a sprint or two?
I think you do. I think there's a lot of value in doing it from the start, even like when you're, because just about everybody does that. You start a project and you just like flush out a bunch of tickets. Like, here's a bunch of things we're going to need to do. And if you can, while you're in that initial design visionary mode, however you want to look at it, when you're initially putting some of that stuff together, or even along the way, I think it is very, particularly if you want Agile to be its most valuable to your organization, is when those ideas come up of like, hey, here's a requirement, flesh it out as best you can and put it into the backlog. Because what you want to do is cover, hey, remember we talked about this. And if you've got notes about it, it's going to help that much more. In particular, if you have a great idea and you're like, this is a feature we need to have, and everybody's like, yeah, that's a great feature. And then you leave the company 6 months later, but they don't actually implement it until a year after that, at least your ticket has survived and you've got enough details that either you can go to everybody, the rest of the group or whoever it is, and say, hey, here's something we had. I don't really get it. Can we talk through it? And maybe it comes real, or it may be something you look at and you're like, okay, we don't get it, we don't understand it, it doesn't make sense anymore. Just toss it, because it's at the end of the day, that's the thing, is you can always throw a requirement out, or you can just kick it down the road and say, you know what, we don't get it right now, we'll deal with it later. But when you're working it, yeah, you want it to be fresh. But I think it is very useful, and it is probably helpful to all of us to have something where we're like noting those little ideas as we go and making sure as best we can we've got some details around it. So even ourselves, we can look at it 6 months from now and go, what the heck was I thinking? oh yeah, this is where it would do this and then it would do that. We have that information and have tracked it so that we can help ourselves down the road, as opposed to, okay, we're gonna just focus on the here and now, and all that other stuff we're not going to bother with. That's like, even when it's a non small team, non-agile kind of approach. I work with customers all the time where it's like, hey, this is, version one or an MVP or something like that. And we have this ever growing section that is in the future, future phase, next phase, whatever. And we just throw stuff in there because, like, oh, we do want to do this, but we really don't know what it's going to look like. We really don't want to spend time on it now because we may not get there, particularly in an MVP world. Maybe you build that MVP, you get it out in front of customers, and there's a lot of stuff you want to do to like really help them. But first, you want to make sure those customers exist and they're willing to pay for it. So there is a lot that goes into that. But the short answer, even though I know I've already blown that time out, the short answer is yes, you want to track every one of those things, put what you can into it at the time, but also be careful about getting too deep into the analysis side of it. Don't put implementation details in, things like that. Instead, if it's something that's going to go in the backlog, just give yourself enough information, or for somebody else to understand where you're going with it, so then they can find a way to take that story. Again, it's that story, that why, that feature, and build it into whatever this thing looks like 6 months or a year down the road. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. And that was kind of where I was hoping you were going to go with that, because one of the things I've seen in some of the places I've worked is some of the project managers or the business will kind of backfill the backlog with potential projects that are coming down the line, and they are very highly um, loosely defined tickets. And yeah, we flush them out, but then we don't touch them for 6 months. We talk about it again, but then we don't touch it for another month. What I've seen, and this is, I don't know if you've seen this too, but typically in most agile sprints that I've worked in a good shop, you're always reviewing or re-reviewing what you're going to pull in for the next sprint. Or essentially, the top 5 items in the top of your backlog are always fresh and have pretty much the mostly defined requirements that you need. Yes, if you go to the backlog and you pull it out, take a second, read through the ticket, read through the requirements, make sure it still makes sense, make sure that what you're currently working on didn't change it. Typically, my rule of thumb, every ticket is wrong. It's just my rule of thumb. It's the tester in me. I look at something and I have to immediately know, how is the user or how is this ticket supposed to work? How am I supposed to touch it? How am I supposed to click it? What do I do with this ticket? What's the outcome? Not necessarily a black box, but if I give it A and B, I get C. Okay, great. That tells me specifically, if I'm doing this, I get this, which leads to, how you test driven development, these tickets. But if you think that way when you're refining the tickets and you're looking at those requirements, no matter where you're at in this process, you should be okay. And if you do it first, you're going to spend less time, less headaches, and not bang your head against the wall on tickets where essentially my computer doesn't work. Well, why doesn't it work? Nothing's in the description. But when the person or support finally calls the customer back and says, okay, what's the problem? And after spending 1, 2, 3 hours on the call with them, you find out, well, their computer doesn't work because they're in the middle of a blackout.
Yeah, you've always got to think a little bit outside of the box when you're tracking some of those things down. But I think that is a nice thing about test driven development, and even having where it is useful for developers to have any kind of like QA testing kind of background, because it does help us to think through, okay, what are the potential inputs and what are the outputs based on those, and what are the exceptions and what are the errors and what are the message, and asking those kinds of questions, because that's almost going to apply to everything you ever build, and to some level. And I think just getting those questions often starts the conversation to get deeper into it. If it's a ticket, an issue, or a problem you're solving that's at a bigger scale, there's going to be all these little ones that are going to end up being that are going to grow out of that conversation. Slight segue, I guess, is that this has grown out of just a couple of very simple questions and conversations, but we're going to wrap this one up because hey, we're going to try to respect your time as best we can. Uh, as always, shoot us some questions if you have any at info@developreneur.com. Check out the site. Subscribe wherever you have podcasts that you're listening to. All the different things out there. We're out there somewhere. Go find Developreneur or Building Better Developers, depending on. We use that because some of these things that are voice activated, they don't understand the word developreneur as well as they do building better developers. That's why we converted our tagline to the name at one point. That being said, go out there and have yourself a great day, a great week, and we will talk to you next time. And for the rest of you, thank you so much for hanging out. This has been again, we're going down some rabbit holes, and we've warned you that this would happen, that these are the kinds of conversations we have. And I think they're probably the conversations you have as well. Is that, sometimes we just start talking about problems and we have more problems. It's just like requirements. You have a requirement, you start talking about it, and now they have more requirements, and it starts to, sort of snowball until you get to the point where you finally start hitting leaves at the end of all of those little, branches that you've hit from off of all of your requirements. So I think we will wrap this one up. Well, thank you again for your time. Check us out, subscribe, say hi, leave comments, all that good stuff, because that just helps us give better content and just better copy and such for you as well. So you guys as well, go out there, have yourself a great time, and we will see you on our next episode. As we're just going to continue cranking through on the podcast side. We are cranking through season 21, and we're just moving along those episodes. And then here we're just going to continue on the YouTube side, continue to crank these things out. And periodically, I promise, I know I mentioned it before and I have not in a while put out some of the tutorials, but we will return to those. It's just been a little bit busy time, and we're hoping to settle that down a little bit and throw a couple of those little tutorials out. Again, if you have questions, comments, or requests for tutorials, in particular, anything related to some of the stuff we've done in the last couple of years, MySQL, SQL in general, MariaDB, Python, Java, let us know, and we'll see what we can do to help you out and throw a little tutorial together, or we may have some fun exploring whatever that technology is as well. Go out, have yourself a great time, and we will talk to you next time.